Hello, thanks for joining us. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to our webinar on water financial management for Illinois systems. My name is Tess Clark. I work here at the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center, and we will be getting started in just a minute, but first there are a few logistical items that I wanted to mention. First, everyone will be on mute just to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, just type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box anytime throughout the session. All of the questions will be reserved for a Q&A at the end, but feel free to send questions at any point. We will be making today's slides available as well as a video recording on the EFCN website. You can reach that website at www.efcnetwork.org. All of our webinars can be found under the Past Events tab, and we also send out a link to the recording via email, which you could click yourself or even forward to somebody else that might have missed the webinar. This webinar is actually part of a series of 3 webinars that we are doing on small water system management for Illinois systems. So don't forget to register and attend our next one, which will be October 2nd. Please record the course ID for Illinois EPA continuing education hours if you need it. If you've joined this webinar with the intention of using it to support CEU hours, please know that we can only supply certificates after we verify attendance. It can take 1 to 2 weeks to send out certificates, and you must attend the entire webinar to receive one. You must be viewing the slides and listening to audio. If you have any other questions about this, you can email us at smallsystems@syr.edu. Now for a little bit about us. The Environmental Finance Center Network provides training and technical assistance to small public water systems in all U.S. states and territories to help local water systems achieve their goals and stay in compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. As you might guess, the EFCN is a university-based network. You can see a list of all of our network members here. We work together to create solutions to difficult how-to-pay issues of environmental protection and improvement. On that note, I'd like to introduce Nick Willis from the Environmental Finance Center at Wichita State University. Nick is an experienced professional engineer and technical assistance provider. Previously, Nick worked in a regulatory capacity at the Arkansas Department of Environmental Quality and also in a management capacity in the city of Hays, Kansas. As a program manager at WSU EFC, Nick works with small systems on issues like financial management and asset management planning, as well as a couple areas of expertise, which you can all see here. So welcome, Nick. Thanks for joining us today and sharing your knowledge. I'm going to make you a presenter.
Okay. And here we go. All right, thank you for the introduction. So first, I'd like to thank everybody who registered and is on this webinar. I understand there's several attendees who are members of boards or city councils who have oversight responsibilities on water utilities and most likely other municipal run utilities as well. I have experience working for municipal utilities directly, and also my father has been on a city commission in a small community. It's a largely poorly paid, relatively thankless job. So I applaud you for taking your time to learn more a little bit about the finances of water utility management. I would like to note that if you are on this webinar because you're looking for potential assistance points, the EFC network is a good point of contact. We can maybe help you or at least direct you to the correct people to talk to. So with that, I'll begin the webinar topics. Today we're going to begin by talking about financial capacity, what it is. We're going to talk about some ways we can judge how our own utility finances are doing by looking at financial reserves and financial ratios. We will also look at the topic of revenue sufficiency, which is another way of framing, do we have enough money coming in to pay our bills? Water utilities are funded almost entirely by user rates and fees, so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the basics of water rates. We're also going to talk about the importance of long-term planning. Most everyone on the call who works in the utility industry is working for a utility that's quite a bit older than you are, and will hopefully be around much longer after you've retired, and some of these utilities may last hundreds of years into the future. So the importance of long-term planning can't be overstressed. And we'll finally talk about some of the aspects of financing water projects, both in general and specific to the state of Illinois. And with that, we'll cover very, very briefly the topic of creditworthiness, because if you are going to use outside loan or bond dollars to finance a water utility project, the person lending you the money, the institution lending you the money, wants it back. So just like in personal finances, there's things you can do to be a better credit risk. There are things you can do to be a better credit risk as a water utility or a municipality at large. So why do we care about finances with regards to water utility situations? So what we've seen over time, there's around about 55,000 water utilities, regulated water utilities in the United States, which is a very large number. The vast majority of those are very small utilities, and what regulators have seen over time is that systems with unsustainable funding will eventually fail. And they'll fail in a myriad of ways. Maybe they're not able to attract a qualified operator, and so their system isn't being run properly. Something breaks or a chemical isn't added, and you have problems that way. Maybe they're not able to reinvest over time. They have the infrastructure they have today, and there's not enough money to reinvest in it and replace things as they wear out and break. There's other possible issues with regard to unsustainable funding that can also occur. The US EPA and the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency also both care. In the 1990s, the US Congress, with a regulatory administration by the US EPA, brought about to the Safe Drinking Water Act the idea of capacity development, where the regulators are looking at technical, financial, and managerial capacity. We're talking about the financial capacity today. So it's important to them that you have the technical ability to operate your system, you have adequate water resources, adequate infrastructure, and things like that, and you have managerial capacity and also financial capacity. So that's important as to why we're talking about finances today. As previously mentioned, your lenders want their money back, so lenders care about your finances. And then we can look at the broader reason why we have water utilities, and for most of the people on the line who run municipal or are involved in municipal organizations, sewer utilities, protection of health and environment are utmost keys to why we care about the utility finances, because if the utilities fail, public health, the environment are both at risk. It's also a reflection of government in a broader sense. So most people on the line and most community water utilities are attached to a county or a municipal entity. So if the finances of the water utility are not well run, that reflects poorly on the rest of the municipal operations, even if they're run impeccably. And it also will impact citizen trust in decision makers in the local community. So with that, we're now going to move to the topic of how are most utilities funded. And obviously there are different ways to fund utilities, but for the most part, public drinking water supplies that are supplying communities are funding two types of expenditures. They are funding operational expenditures. So if you have an annual budget, most of your operational expenditures would be expressed in this. You are charging utilities, utility customers rates and fees, and that money, a decent portion of it leaves the utility almost immediately by paying for things like labor, chemicals, some repairs, consumable products, energy, sometimes short-lived equipment, tools, things like that. Sometimes some infrastructure is also locked in there. And then we have the other bucket of expenditures, to again paint this with a broad brush, is capital expenditures. So these are basically infrastructure, so new water pipe, new storage, new wells, new treatment plant upgrades, things like that. The vast majority of this money is also coming from rates and fees from your customers. So the main difference is that oftentimes these are financed over time. So you take out a loan or a bond. So your capital expenditures are your infrastructure principal and the interest on the debt as it's paid off. So I'm going to cover a few best practices in utility finances before moving on to talk about some of the metrics you might want to look at for your own utility. But at a very high level, utilities should be self-supporting financial institutions. So what that means is that utilities are neither subsidizing or being subsidized by other governmental functions. And for standalone water utilities, this is how they operate. So a rural water district or a water cooperative or something like that, that's their only source of revenue. But for municipal utility operations, it's often pretty easy to blur some of those lines. So if you question the finances of your utility, you might want to look to see if money is being brought in or taken out of it in day-to-day operations. So how can you subsidize? One example would be that the water utility fund is transferring money to the street fund or parks or anything else like that. Or indirectly, and we see this particularly with smaller municipal operations. So the water fund might pay the full wages and benefits of an employee who spends half their time repairing streets. Either way of either of those examples is not considered best practice because we're basically overcharging in this case utility customers in order to keep streets up. Another best practice is that utilities should charge full cost of service pricing, and we'll touch on this a little further, but some of the aspects of what this means is that you are examining your income and expenses on a regular basis, and that you're charging enough money to your utility customers to maintain the system. So basically, you're able to reinvest in assets over time so that the overall level of service your utility provides its customers is maintained or in some cases improved over time. Another best practice in utility finances is that utilities are able to use pricing to help reach other policy goals. And where we see this most often is with regard to water conservation. So to minimize water usage, we might charge more for high water users than low water users, so that as you use more water, the water gets more expensive. Very commonly done in the Western United States, and I'm sure you know, in the Eastern U.S., you see that to a lesser degree, but probably will grow as water resources become tighter and more restricted in the East. So that is a perfectly legitimate use and a best practice of utility finances. So we're now going to talk a little more about the idea of financial capacity. How it is actually defined is sort of a three-legged stool. EPA has defined it as having revenue sufficiency, creditworthiness, and fiscal management and controls. We're going to be talking about the topics of revenue sufficiency and creditworthiness. The ideas behind fiscal management and controls are the type of information you will find at state level leads of municipalities, meetings, basic city clerk and city treasurer, type of training opportunities. So things like, how do you handle checks? How do you handle cash? When do we have audits for our utility finances? That sort of thing I'm not really going to be covering today, but it is one of the 3 legs of financial capacity that EPA puts out there. So bringing this up to a higher level, financial capacity means that the utility has financial resources to supply safe drinking water in the short and the long term. So basically, there's enough money available to do what we need to do as a utility, both today and into the foreseeable future. So the idea of revenue sufficiency is that you have enough income to meet your ongoing expenses. So we'll be looking at a couple ratios that can give you a good idea as to whether your utility has enough income to meet your ongoing expenses. So those ongoing expenses, things like electricity, labor, chemicals, debt payments that are currently due, and if you are purchasing water, the purchase of water. Those are kind of going to be the big expenses for typical utilities out there. The other thing you look at with revenue sufficiency is that you're going to have enough money to meet upcoming expenses. Utilities from year to year typically don't have a whole lot of changes, but sometimes they have major changes. So for example, you might have a new loan payment coming up next year. Do you have enough money to pay that back? Or you might be changing how your utility is operated. So maybe a new treatment plant is coming into service. That's going to change maybe your labor, maybe your electrical usage, maybe your chemical demands. So are you able to meet those upcoming expenses as well? And then finally, with regard to revenue sufficiency, whether or not your utility adequately funds reserves, we'll be talking about those very quickly here. So some of these reserves and some of the ratios to consider when you are a board member or a manager of a utility will be covered in the next few slides. A couple points on this I'd like to make. First, there are more recommended reserves out there, and the recommendations will vary by your source. I'm covering a few of them, but depending on your situation, you may want to have other reserves than are just covered here. And then the idea behind financial ratios, there's hundreds of financial ratios out there. I'm covering just a few of them that are relatively quickly calculated, relatively easy to keep track of month to month, year to year, and that are going to be valuable to the water utility industry. There are ratios out there that are financial ratios that are used by company analysts, stock analysts, and things like that, some of which might be applicable to water utility situations, other ones that would be ridiculous to use. So you don't want to use a ratio, a financial ratio that was developed to gauge the performance of a software company when you're looking at your water utilities finances. So keep in mind, if you go crazy out there on the internet searching for financial ratios that would make sense, a lot of them are not going to make any sense for your specific situations. So the first reserve we want to look at is operating reserves. So basically, this is just funds you have in place, so money in the bank in most cases, in case your operating expenses suddenly increase or revenue decreases. And both of these do happen from time to time in your utility. When I was in utility management, we had a couple employees go on family medical leave, leave. We had a 24/7 water treatment plant operation, so it was staffed every hour of the day, every day of the year. Our overtime budget was exceeded by quite a bit that year, but we had operating reserves. That's the type of thing we were able to handle as a utility without really any hardship. Operating expenses can and do increase from time to time unexpectedly. That is one reason to have operating reserves. The other thing that can happen is that your revenue can decrease. So one thing that may happen, you may lose, a sizable portion of your town in a flood or a tornado. Those are customers that are gone. The cost structure of your utility hasn't really changed in that case. You're still going to probably have the same number of operators. Your water production typically is relatively low cost for most utility operations. So water utilities tend to have high fixed cost, low variable cost. In the case of having a customer loss, you're going to have revenue decreases without subsequent cost declines in most situations for water utilities. So that sort of thing can happen. You may also have a major purchaser of water in your utility, maybe a factory or production facility that changes their production process and or changes, shuts down. What does that do to you? That is another reason to have operating reserves in place. Your operating reserve should generally be the equivalent of at least 3 months of operating cost. Generally recommended, more is higher. Aim for 6 or more. So half a year of operating cost is a recommendation for that. Depending on your specific utility situation, you may want to go higher than that, depending on what some of the risks are out there for you. So really, the operating reserve recommendation is very similar to what would be recommended by a financial planner for an individual. You need to have 3 to 6 months of savings at the bank in case if you lose your job, a tree falls on your house and you have to replace the roof. That's the sort of stuff that you don't plan for, but that happens every day in people's lives. Similar types of cushions are needed for water utilities. Another type of reserve I'd like to stress is the idea behind equipment replacement reserve. So everybody here on the call has equipment in their utility system that is expensive if you just go out and buy it like with your personal funds, but not so expensive that it makes a lot of sense to issue a bond or take on a loan to pay for. So things might be $5,000 or $25,000. You should plan to replace this type of equipment and things like vehicles to the degree that you can with money, without going into debt, without having to bear all the cost of the processes of that. So to develop an equipment replacement reserve, first you have to kind of develop an inventory of your assets. So think about things like electrical motors, vehicles, pumps, water meters, maybe fire hydrants as pictured here. You'll then have to prioritize those assets. So which of these are maybe needing replaced very soon, and estimate the replacement dates of those assets. And then you're going to have to determine the cost of the scheduled rehabilitation or replacement of those. So a simple example here is you might have an electrical motor serving a pump in your utility system. You expect it to cost 10 years from now, $20,000 to replace. So annually, in your annual budgeting process, you'd fund the equipment replacement reserve with $2,000 so that you're able to replace this motor out of cash reserves 10 years from now. If you do this with all of the things that have service lives of 3 to maybe 20 years, you're going to be in pretty good shape for that sort of stuff, and you'll be in pretty good physical condition with respect to that medium life asset within your utility operations. The final, almost the final reserve we're going to talk about is the idea behind capital improvement reserves. So these are reserves that are being set aside to fund really big projects. So think new well field, new treatment facility, replacement of significant portions of the pipe in your utility, maybe a new water tower or ground storage tank, that sort of stuff. Things that are hundreds of thousands of dollars in cost. You want to have a capital improvement reserve to, at a minimum, pay some of the upfront costs associated with capital improvements. So if you want to build a new water tower, if you start today, it's going to be a year or two in the future before your water tower is in service. There's things like engineering that will have to be done, permit review. You might have to buy land. Going to have to get some surveys possibly with that. Attorneys might get involved. And those are costs that occur in the near future. A capital improvement plan, the reserves for capital improvement can help to pay for those sort of costs up front. And then you might take on debt to pay the construction cost in the future. So your capital improvement reserves, they should be informed by your capital improvement plan. At a minimum, use capital improvement reserves to reduce debt burden. This is your reserve fund that is most likely to have large swings in value. So if you decided to, for example, fund a new water tower entirely in cash, your reserve fund would get very, very big. Your capital improvement reserve fund would get very large. And then once you, completed construction, it would be mostly depleted after you paid out all of that cash. So capital improvement reserves are good for prudent long-term planning. The final reserve I'm going to talk about is debt reserves, and you may not have to have these in your specific utility situation. In fact, if you don't have to have them, there's really no reason to have a debt reserve. So a lot of the funding agencies out there that I'll be talking about just here in a couple minutes will require a debt reserve account to be maintained. Typically, it's 10% of the initial principal. So if you take out $1 million loan, you might have to have $100,000 available as a debt service reserve. This functions to reduce the risk of default by the utility and therefore makes it more secure. You can get lower interest rates with a debt service reserve. The problem is that you're tying up a whole lot of money. So you can typically fund the debt service reserve from proceeds of the loan or the bonds. So if you had $1 million project, you would have to take out $1.1 million in loans and put $100,000 in the debt service reserve. So alternatively, you could have built up a capital improvement reserve to $100,000 and only have to take out $1 million in debt. So that shows some of the value of the capital improvement reserves right there. So these are things to think about. If you are indebted, you need to understand what the requirements to maintain compliance with the language of the debt instrument are, because you can be in technical default if you are not compliant with things like debt service reserves or debt service coverage ratios. So if you think you're in trouble, if you think things might be awry with the debt out there, you definitely want to read the documents and they will tell you what is required of them. Moving on to ratios, we're going to cover a few here. The first is operating ratio, which will judge if the incoming cash is sufficient to pay the bills. So the operating ratio, as defined here, is the operating revenues divided by the operating expenses. So basically income divided by your expenditures. In this case, you need it to be greater than 1.0. Otherwise, you're spending down reserve funds from somewhere. One note, if you go on the internet and search for this, different industries will flip the numerator and denominator. So if they're flipped, you obviously would want it to be less than 1, where your expenses are lower than your revenues. So just keep in mind if you're like, oh, we need to do this for our utility. In my work with utilities, I do often recommend that they track this on a monthly and annual basis because it's a good way to judge if your utility is having enough income to pay the expenses. If the operating ratio goes to less than 1 for more than a couple months, that should be an alarm going off. Hey, we need to look at our rates, or we need to look at our expenses, or both. And you definitely don't want the operating ratio being less than 1 for very long. And if it does go under 1, you need to understand why. Sometimes, it's something extraordinary has happened, but oftentimes it's just expenses have gone up or revenues have gone down too much. A second quick ratio that I often recommend when dealing with utilities is to keep track of days of cash on hand. So this is basically a calculation that shows how long you could operate without any additional income coming into your system, which is a very unlikely situation, I will give you that. but you can, again, have significant interruptions in income in your utility operations from time to time, typically are disaster related. But those do happen, and part of being prepared for them is being financially prepared for them. So your days of cash on hand is a pretty easy calculation to do as part of your monthly financial report that you would receive as a board member, and also on an annual basis you can do this. So basically you're taking your unrestricted cash and investments and divided it by your daily operating expense, and you're peeling out your depreciation and amortization from that, because both of those are expenses shown in accounting but are not actual cash expenses. You don't actually have to put cash aside to pay depreciation expense if you're keeping track of that. This again, 3 to 6 months. If you don't have that, that's a sign that you should look more closely at your finances. Moving on to water rates. I have 2 slides on this, and we regularly give day-long trainings on finances and rate setting. So you are getting a very, very abbreviated, inadequate in total discussion here. So when it comes to water rates, as a board member, as a utility manager, the vast majority of your utility income is likely to come from rates. So if you don't have rates right, you're unlikely to have a good financial situation. So it's very important that your water rates are established where you're able to cover your cost and set aside money for the future, and fund those reserves that we've talked about. If you don't get your water utility rates right, you're not going to have good financial capacity, and things will start to go bad over time as you're unable to attract qualified operators, as you're unable to replace that medium life equipment or to make those capital improvements over time. You should look at your rates annually, or if you have a longer than annual budget, on a periodic basis. You should not adjust rates every 10 years. It should be a frequent item of discussion based upon analysis of your income and your expenditures. So typically, if you're doing annual budgets, that would be the time to evaluate your water rates, whether they're sufficient or not. I would have the same recommendation for sewer utilities in most situations. So most water utilities are going to have a rate structure sort of like what I'm laying out here, where there's both a monthly minimum charge and then some sort of a volumetric rate. So the monthly minimum is going to be expressed as, to have water service, it's $25 a month. And then the volumetric rate is going to be expressed as something like, for every 1,000 gallons you use, it's $5. So if you use 1,000 gallons in this scenario, it'd be $30. If you use 2,000 gallons, it'd be $35, and so on. This is typically a relatively easy type of rate to understand, explain, and administer. And that moves me on to water rates 102. Generally speaking, simple water rates are better, particularly for smaller systems. 2 things you want to consider here: administrative burden. So, what kind of billing software do you have to have? When your utility billing clerk is speaking to customers, is that going to be a very quick conversation because it's a straightforward rate structure, or because of all the intricacies of it, that's going to take 15 or 20 minutes for them to explain? So think about administrative burden when you're looking at your water rate structure, and also customer confusion. Customers who have a high water bill and they understand why the water bill is high are probably not going to be super happy about it, but they're not going to complain that they were hoodwinked into this high water bill. So think about a water rate structure that your customers can easily understand, and then they understand why they're being billed, what they are. So communication of the water rates is important. It's also important to consider the extra costs that are associated with 2 things at a minimum. And this will really vary depending on your utility infrastructure and what's going on in your community at large. So two things can really incur high costs to water utilities. The first of these are high flow rates. So this would be flow rates that are typically quite low, and then maybe an industry. So for example, there's breweries everywhere now. When they fill their tank, they typically are running at a very high flow rate. That might put extra stress and demand on your utility system, and that should maybe be billed back to the brewery in your town who's having this high flow rate. It may not really cause much extra cost to your utility. So that really, the high flow rates is something you need to look at. Are we limited on pumping capacity or pipe capacity? If you are, you might want to consider extra costs for high flow rate availability by customers. And then you might also consider high volumetric usage, particularly if it's seasonal. So if you are a community where there's a lot of outside irrigation during the summertime, you're going to have additional wells, additional treatment capacity, larger pipes, larger pumps, and those are really going to be only used 3 or 4 months of the year, but you have to pay for them. You have to maintain them every day of the year. So oftentimes rates are targeted at that higher volumetric usage, particularly if it's seasonal, where that type of use is charged at a higher rate. The final part of Water Rates 102, I'd like to stress, is that water service can become unaffordable. This graph on the right is from the American Water Works Association in 2015. The blue line shows the Consumer Price Index, which is basically what you will hear about on the news. The inflation rate went up or down, or was 0 or was 2%. That's typically the CPI. So it shows this, the graph shows this from 88 to 2014. If you had that basket of goods in 1988 that the CPI represents, and it was $10, it would now be about $21. If you had a $10 water bill, however, in 1988, by 2014, it would be about $34. And if you had that $10 wastewater bill in 1988, it would now be about $43 or $44. So there's not a lot of indication out there that the water and wastewater rates are going to begin to increase in line with the Consumer Price Index. Because of aging infrastructure, it's suspected that these rates will continue to go up higher than inflation as a whole. That eventually becomes burdensome on your most financially strapped customers. So depending on your community, this might already be a big issue, or it might be one in a couple of years, or it might be one 15 years down the line. But keep in mind when you're looking at your water utilities, your water rates, some of the poorest households in town may not be able to afford what is necessary in order to reinvest in your system. So there's a lot of people working on this throughout the country. There's a lot of political discussion. For the sake of this webinar, I want to make you aware of this issue. If you think it is an issue in your community right now, I encourage you to do your research and look at various types of ways that utilities are trying to ensure that every household has, safe water and sewer services without overburdening them financially. We're now going to turn to long-term planning and finances. So the main drivers for a specific utility are going to vary when it comes to long-term planning and the finances associated with it. But generally speaking, here's what pushes water utilities over the long term and will drive a lot of their financing. First, stuff wears out. A lot of water utilities have infrastructure that's at least 50 years old, sometimes well over 100 years old. Eventually, it becomes unserviceable. Stuff also becomes obsolete. Things like control systems, computers, specialized equipment will often no longer have parts availability. you're going to have to deal with obsolescence in your utility systems. Regulations also change. We have two that are likely to have changes in the relatively near future, PFAS and PFOS. They're long-lived chemicals often associated with fire retardants, are in many water supplies. There's Congress is busy looking at different regulatory changes. There's a lot of unknown information, but sometime in the near future, I would not be surprised if there were some sort of regulations. If that impacts you, that's going to change your cost structure, change what you have to do to be a compliant utility. Lead and copper is the other rule out there that's likely to have some regulations change over the coming years. And there may be some others out there as well that are less talked about in the utility industry right now. Environmental conditions can change. We have water utilities throughout the Midwest that have had to do something with regards to nitrates. They weren't doing anything wrong, but their water supply became polluted with nitrates. And water utilities have to deal with that. The environment can change on you. Many utilities and towns have stagnant and or declining populations. The utility still has to function and be compliant regardless of the population and demographic dynamics of your community. So that may be a big driver for long-term planning in your specific utility. It's very important that you understand the pressures on your system. Many of the pressures on your system, such as demographics, your population dynamics, are going to be the same stressors on your municipality as a whole. So keep your utilities in mind when you're looking at future planning efforts in your communities. So on long-term planning basics for water utilities when it comes to financing, you kind of need to plan for two things that we've already talked about. That equipment replacement planning. So you might say, let's set aside $1,000 annually so we can pay for a new well pump 10 years from now. That's about how long the old one lasted. Equipment replacement planning is really applied common sense and making your best estimate as to future costs. It doesn't have to be super detailed. You don't have to get consulting engineers in the room. This is something that board and staff are typically able to take care of on their own. And you're not going to be perfect. Nobody can predict the future. That's okay. But if you're planning for it, that's a lot better than not planning for it. So if you can begin equipment replacement planning over the long term, that will really help you. Your capital improvement planning, this is going to be, again, that long-lived infrastructure. So, for example, you might have a capital improvement project that says, let's replace 3 miles of water mains in 2021. You're going to have to get more detailed on that. We are choosing to finance it through the USDA Rural Development Loan Program. And because we have to repay that debt, we're going to increase our water rates by 22% by then to begin paying back that loan. So I mentioned the loan. Let's talk about finance. Your large water infrastructure projects are generally going to have some sort of debt financing. It is not required. If you can pay in cash, great. But long-lived infrastructure is typically has some sort of debt financing on it. So what's available specific to Illinois? I contacted to learn more. And we'll also talk about grants. Everybody wants grants, free money. I'll tell you a little bit about what is out there as well. So your loan programs, and I will tell you that it's much easier to get a loan than to get a grant. The main loan programs for water and sewer utilities are the Illinois State Revolving Loan Fund. There's actually two funds here. One is for the Safe Drinking Water Act. The other is Clean Water Act, which covers sewer and stormwater projects. It is administered by the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency. So search for the State Revolving Loan Fund within the state of Illinois. You will get contact information and reach out to them to begin discussing financing options. USDA Rural Development for small utilities in non-metropolitan areas is also commonly used. So this is the United States Department of Agriculture. They loan for all sorts of utilities, but for the sake of this, I'm limiting it to water and sewer and stormwater projects. The good thing about USDA rural development loans are that some of them can go out to 40 years for repayment terms, which can make a project much more affordable to current ratepayers. So that is typically the great thing about the USDA rural development program. It's also very important to don't forget about bond issuance. If you're able to issue bonds, that is another way to pay for utility infrastructure. So now we'll be covering grants and loan principal forgiveness. They're not the same thing, but they're kind of the same thing. Basically, you're getting money. You're not having to return the money to the lender in the case of a loan principal forgiveness. So the big one here is probably the Community Development Block Grant, which is administered by the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. These are competitive grants. You have to also meet eligibility guidelines. So to learn about those, search for the Community Development Block Grant within the state of Illinois, and you can get more information and begin to see whether or not you would have a qualifying type of project. The state revolving loan funds also have principal forgiveness, which can help make a project more affordable. And then the USDA Rural Development also administers some grants, and there's a specific program called the Emergency Community Water Assistance Grants, which is very limited in the type of situation it can apply. It's typically some sort of very dire need for a community has had some sort of a natural disaster happen, like a drought or a flood, that is making its infrastructure unusable or unsafe to use. It's an accelerated program. It's a great program. It's great. It's out there, but most kind of routine infrastructure type of projects are not going to qualify for it. But I wanted to mention it because if you are in dire need, if your single well is about to begin to be unserviceable, that might be an option for you. I would strongly encourage you to reach out to the people. They are paid to, the people who are administering the program. They want their programs to be successful, to fund good projects, to benefit local places within the state of Illinois. Obviously, there are some restrictions on all of these, whether a project is eligible or not. Typically, the websites get you a long ways there, but do feel free to reach out to the people. They are there to help you and to assist you, and they also typically know details of the other programs that I've mentioned here. So they're there to assist you in this. Most people who would be on this call haven't probably gone through this process, and hopefully you don't have to do it frequently in your life, because capital improvement projects are often infrequent for smaller utility systems. I'm going to finish up with the idea of creditworthiness. So again, as we spoke, lenders want their money back. So how do you convince lenders that you're going to be a good credit risk, that you will pay back? Fundamentally, behave responsibly as a utility. Lenders are going to have certain metrics that they want to see once you're repaying them, and you need to make sure your utility finances are going to be able to do that. But in the meantime, keep track of those ratios over time. Have positive cash flow, make sure your operating ratio is greater than 1, that sort of thing. It's important to monitor your rates and income over time. Have sound policies out there regarding finances. Do things like annual audits. Make sure that you have two-party signatories on your checks and all that good information. Very important, meet your current debt obligations. Most lenders are not too keen on loaning you additional money when you're not paying your current lenders back. So make sure you're meeting your current debt obligations. If you are seeking a loan, contact the funders I mentioned earlier in this webinar. They are helpful. They can provide good assistance and guidance, both for the process and also what to expect once you begin paying back the debt. If you're looking at bonding, reach out to peers who've recently issued bonds and the municipal advisory community if you are issuing those bonds, and they will help you because that's kind of their role in the world today. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions, and I am going to leave you with my information. Feel free to give me a call or send me an email about any of the topics after the webinar is over as well. With that, I'll take any questions.
Great. Okay, thanks. We'll get started with the questions really quickly. First, while we have time, we like to ask people attending our webinars about technical assistance. Like Nick mentioned, technical assistance is something that the Environmental Finance Center Network can provide, especially if you need help maybe accessing or learning about funding opportunities or getting the ball rolling on some of the financial management planning strategies that Nick discussed. So if you know you'd like to speak with an expert about something related, you can let us know here and we'll get in touch with you. And if not, no worries. So we will leave this open for maybe 2 more seconds. I'm going to go ahead and close this poll now. So thanks for taking that. And then another thing I wanted to share with you is we do like to send out a little survey for our webinar. So if you want to give us your feedback, I'm sending that out in the chat box. And with that, we can get right into questions. Just a reminder, if you are wondering about the PowerPoint, I know that comes up a lot. We will make the slides available. You'll be able to go through all this information again if you need to, and it'll be up on our website shortly. So the first question that we have today is, you had mentioned early in the presentation some terminology, a fixed cost and a variable cost. Do you think you could remind us what some examples of a fixed cost versus a variable cost might be? Sure.
So probably the best example of a fixed cost would be a loan payment or a bond payment that's due. So you might have a $10,000 payment this year. Regardless of how much water you sell, you have to make that payment. Variable cost would be something like that changes based upon how much water you're producing or selling. So one of those might be electricity used in water pumping, chemicals used in water treatment. And then you have costs that are kind of in that gray area. So I tend to think most labor costs in water utilities tend to be fixed, but you might run overtime hours or staff a treatment plant for more hours than a day during periods of high demand, in which that would be somewhat variable. So it's not necessarily clear cut with regards to if a cost is entirely fixed or entirely variable. Oftentimes they're kind of both, if that makes some sense. So yeah. And if you have a specific question, I'm happy to go into detail on your specific situation. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. If you do have questions and we don't get to them during the next 5 minutes or so of Q&A, we can get back in touch with you via email. And like I mentioned, we will be sending out the slides. So we will send out a follow-up email. It'll have a link to this PDF, and you'll be able to get your hands on it very shortly. So moving on, you had mentioned that water may be becoming more unaffordable. And that's a factor into, your rate setting. You may want to be thinking about that. Do you know that if there are any rate setting mechanisms that are able to maybe take into account or maybe help you adjust for some low income customers from a rate setting perspective?
There's a lot of people working on that. Generally speaking, water rates are a very local issue. Some cities are having water rates based upon your household income. That's going to be incredibly difficult for a community to administer. Some cities are looking at, local charities. So if you're getting other charitable assistance, for example, with your heating bills in the wintertime, maybe you're eligible for some water utility assistance as well. The problem from a water and sewer utility perspective is that the costs typically are what they are. So if you're decreasing the cost on some customers, you're going to increase them on others, which is politically sometimes a pretty tough thing to do. One way to make water more affordable that a lot of cities with limited water resources are doing is to aim conservation programs at low-income households. So, you know, you can get a free toilet if you're a low-income household that uses a lot less water every flush, shower heads, things like that. There's a whole lot of ideas out there. I've not seen good indicators to say some are better than others, but it's certainly something I'd be willing to help anybody out at. It's a complex issue. There's some good thought leaders out there too that I could direct people to.
Awesome, thanks. That was a really detailed way to put it, I think, for a short, limited time we have for Q&A. So the next question is kind of a little bit broader, and it has to do with the grants process. So if you can imagine that you're a utility with no experience administering a grant previously, do you have any advice for how to maybe work with another utility or a regional organization that could maybe make that process a little bit easier? Just going from the fact that it can take a lot of upfront time and effort to administer a grant, especially if you don't have any experience with it.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing would be where I would start, and you can probably have legitimate ways to start elsewhere. I would determine whether or not you're a good candidate. And I think you can do that by contacting some of the administrators of the grant program you're interested in, telling them about your situation, and they should be able to give you good ideas like, yeah, this is probably worth doing, worth the costs for applying, maybe doing surveys. Depending on the grant program, there's different requirements you would have to meet. So I think a yes, no, whether to even begin pursuing it is probably the first thing to answer. If it's a no, then you don't worry about any of those details. If it's a yes, I don't know within specifically the state of Illinois and the state of Kansas, there are people who do grant administration as part of the community development block grant program. They have fees associated with it, and depending on the grant administrator, some are what's the word? You only pay if you get a grant, and then others are you pay whether or not you get a grant to do the application process and the survey. So, you know, if you talk to the local people at the community development block grant program within Illinois, they should be able to guide you towards those types of resources.
Yeah, that's some really good advice for getting that process kind of started. And maybe if you don't have the capacity to, you know, administer the grant, then that's a good signal to start somewhere else too. Okay, so on that note, I think we've pretty much covered all of the questions for today. Nick, do you have any other closing comments that you'd like to cover while we're all together?
Good questions, and you know, doing big projects is tricky, particularly if you've never done anything. Some of these projects are the biggest projects that your town may ever have done. So, particularly if you're building a treatment facility for water or sewer. So make sure you do your homework, reach out to people like me, reach out to those funders. We're all here to help in the ways that we're able to. So good luck, and again, thank you for your service as a city council person or a board member of a water utility.
Awesome. And don't forget to tune in October 2nd for our next and last webinar. That one's going to be about utility management. So thanks so much and have a great night, everybody.